She was 22 years old, and she had exactly $4 and a dead man's hammer. Settle in, and let us know where you're watching from tonight as we tell you the story of Hattie Drummond. Hattie's life had never been one of ease, but it had been one of purpose. She was the daughter of Ezra Drummond, a blacksmith in the hill country of western Tennessee, who spoke the way most men prayed, rarely, and only when he meant it. He had taught her the language of iron and heat, how to read the color of metal the way a sailor reads the sky, the deep cherry red that meant the steel was ready to be shaped, the blinding yellow-white that meant you'd pushed it too far and lost it. He taught her that a good weld didn't announce itself, it simply held. He died of a lung sickness when Hattie was 16, leaving her his shop, his anvil, and the short-handled cross-peen hammer he'd carried since his own apprenticeship. The hammer's handle was worn smooth in a particular way. Not evenly, but in the shape of his grip, and when Hattie held it, she could feel the ghost of every iron hinge and horseshoe and wagon wheel rim he had ever made. The shop went to debt collectors 8 months after he passed. But the hammer, they couldn't prove was worth anything. So Hattie kept it. She'd survived the years between 16 and 22 the way a lot of young women in small Tennessee towns survived, by being useful. She cooked and cleaned for a widowed schoolteacher named Mrs. Portis. She mended harness leather at the livery. She helped Dr. Ames pull nails and reset a fence when the flood of 1883 took half the county's fence lines with it. She was not a charity case. She worked. But she was always one bad month away from nothing, and she knew it. The man who finally offered her stability was Harlan Foss, 53 years old, a mill owner, and a widower with 2 grown sons from his first marriage. He wasn't cruel, exactly. He was simply the kind of man who had spent 50 years getting what he wanted and had confused that habit for character. He married Hattie in the spring of 1885. She was 21. She told herself it was a practical arrangement, which it was. She told herself she could make a life of it, which she believed, because Hattie Drummond had never been a woman who needed things to be beautiful. She needed them to be solid. It was not solid. It had the appearance of solidity, the big frame house, the mill that turned from before dawn to after dark, the Sunday dinners where Harlan's sons, Clifton and Wade, sat across the table from her with the polite hostility of men who had decided before she arrived that she was a problem to be managed rather than a person to be known. She endured it. She kept the house. She mended Harlan's shirts and kept his accounts with a precision that startled him, because he hadn't expected her to be good at numbers. "Where'd you learn that?" he asked her once, looking over the ledger she'd organized. "My father kept his own books," she said. "He let me do it when I was 12. Harlan grunted. It was not disapproval. It was just that he hadn't prepared a response for the possibility of her being capable. Then Harlan Foss died on a Wednesday afternoon in October of 1885. 6 months and 11 days after their wedding, of a heart that had apparently been failing for years without telling anyone. The funeral was handled by Clifton, the elder son, with the brisk efficiency of a man closing a business transaction. Hattie stood at the graveside in a dress she had made herself, and felt the specific grief of mourning someone you had not quite loved, but had begun cautiously to depend on. The meeting with Clifton Foss happened 3 days later, in Harlan's study, which already smelled more like Clifton's pipe tobacco than her husband's. Clifton was 41, barrel-chested, with the kind of face that had been handsome once and knew it. He did not ask her to sit. He stood behind the desk. His desk now, she understood, and set a single piece of paper on its surface. "The estate has been reviewed," he said. "Father's will, which predates your marriage, leaves the property and the mill to Wade and me jointly. You were married less than a year, with no children, so you have no legal claim beyond what I'm offering you here." He tapped the paper. $30 and the use of the old Kettle Creek outpost for 90 days. "It's a property Father acquired in a land settlement years ago. Nobody's used it in a long time." He paused. "It's something. Better than nothing." Hattie looked at the paper. Then she looked at Clifton Foss. She had in her 22 years been underestimated by people considerably more imaginative than Clifton Foss. She felt something go very still inside her, the way iron goes still just before it's ready to be worked. "I'll be gone by morning," she said. She did not cry. She went back to the room she had shared with Harlan and packed her carpet bag, her spare dress, a bar of lye soap, her father's hammer, wrapped in a piece of flannel, the worn leather apron she'd brought from Ezra's shop and never stopped keeping. She left behind the china Harlan's first wife had picked out, and the curtains she'd sewn for the parlor windows, and the rag rug she'd braided herself over the winter. She left them because she understood, with cold clarity, that Clifton Foss would throw them away as soon as she was out of sight, and she would not give him the satisfaction of leaving behind anything she valued. She took $30 and a deed to a place called the Kettle Creek outpost. The journey took the better part of 2 days. The outpost sat at the edge of the Cumberland foothills, down a rutted logging road that hadn't seen regular use since the war. We'd like you to picture that road. Not the romantic version of it, but the real one. The mud dried hard as brick, the ruts deep enough to break a wagon axle. Low branches that grabbed at a person's hair and coat. The cold coming in from the north with a thin, determined persistence. The kind of cold that didn't announce itself, but simply settled into your bones over the course of hours, until you realized you hadn't been warm since morning. Hattie walked it carrying everything she owned. People saw her on the road. A man driving a load of fence rails slowed his mules, looked at her, and moved on without speaking. A woman hanging laundry on a line watched her pass with an expression caught between pity and relief. Relief that it wasn't her. These were Clifton Foss's people, or they feared becoming his problem, and so they offered nothing. Hattie did not look at them long enough to make them uncomfortable. She kept her eyes on the road and her hand on the strap of her bag, and she walked. She found the outpost as the last daylight was failing. It had been, at some point, a logging operations field station, a storage building, and a small forge room attached to the eastern wall. The whole structure built from rough-cut oak that had gone gray with age but had not, she noted with the eye her father had given her, gone soft. The ridge beam was still true. The stone chimney that rose from the forge side was massive, built by someone who understood that a chimney is not decoration but infrastructure. Most of the windows were gaps. The door hung from one hinge, the other rusted to dust. The floor inside was packed earth, scattered with the evidence of animals and years of weather. But the bones were good. Hattie set down her bag on the least damp section of floor and stood very still for a moment in the failing light. She ran her hand along the wall. Oak, dense and old and stubborn. Her father would have approved. She did not sleep much that first night. She wedged the door shut with a length of branch and lay on her blanket and listened to the windwork at the eaves. But she slept some. Enough. Her first week was a study in priorities, which is to say it was a study in what a person actually needs versus what they think they need. She found water on the second morning, a spring-fed creek about 200 yards southeast, running cold and clear from a rock shelf. She marked the path carefully, breaking small branches at eye level the way her father had taught her to mark property lines in the woods, so she could find it before full light without thinking. Food was harder. She had a small sack of cornmeal, a little dried salt pork, and the knowledge that $30, carefully managed, could keep her in staples for a while if she was disciplined. She was. She also set 2 rabbit snares the first evening, working from memory of her father's method. A simple loop of wire at the right height above a run. She caught 1 rabbit on the 3rd morning and ate it with the cornmeal and felt something shift inside her chest. Not joy, exactly. Something more like the sensation of weight redistributing, of finding your balance. She spent her days assessing the structure and her evenings by the fire she built in the forge room, where the chimney drew so cleanly that the smoke went straight up and the room held heat in a way the main space did not. The forge itself was ruined. The clay lining of the firebox had crumbled away. The bellows rotted to nothing, the iron arm of the crane broken off at the wall mount. But the hearth itself, the stone construction, was sound. It was on her 5th day, while she was clearing years of debris from the forge room floor, that she found it. She had worked her way into the back corner, moving a collapsed wooden shelving unit that had fallen against the rear wall, and there beneath it, mostly hidden by the fallen shelf and the accumulation of years, was a section of the stone floor that didn't match. Everything else was packed earth. This was flat stones, dry-fitted, approximately 6 feet by 4 feet, in the back corner of the forge room where the big exterior chimney foundation met the interior wall. The stones were the same local limestone as the chimney, but they were laid flat rather than stacked, and there was no reason, no structural reason, for a section of stone floor in what was otherwise an earthen-floored room. Her father had told her, more than once, that the most important tool a person has is their attention. She crouched and looked at those stones for a long time. Then she took the cross-peen hammer from her apron pocket and tapped each one. 3 were solid. They rang with the flat sound of stone over earth. The 4th, the one nearest the chimney foundation, rang hollow. Hattie felt her heart do something deliberate and careful in her chest. She tapped it again, hollow, not the hollow of air between 2 surfaces, the hollow of a space. She worked with patience she didn't entirely feel, Using the head of her father's hammer and a flat pry tool, she fashioned from a strip of broken shelving iron. The stone was heavy, perhaps 80 pounds, but it had been fitted dry without mortar. And when she finally found the right leverage angle, it came up with a grinding protest that sounded very loud in the small room. Beneath it was not earth. Beneath it was a wooden trapdoor, maybe 18 inches square, fitted with a simple iron ring pull, its wood dark with age but not rotted. She had to clear the soil from around 2 more of the stones before she could lift it. The smell that came up was dry and mineral and old, not decay, just time. She lowered the hammer into the opening and heard it reach bottom after about 1.5 feet. She lit a pine splinter from the fire and held it down into the hole. A small chamber, dry-walled and fitted stone, no larger than a pantry, and in it 3 things. A metal dispatch box of the kind used by Army field quartermasters, its surface streaked with old rust but its hinged lid intact, a canvas roll tied with a leather cord, the kind used to carry surveying instruments or drafting tools, and a glass jar sealed with wax containing what appeared to be folded papers. Hattie sat back on her heels and looked at the opening in her floor for a long, quiet moment. Then she reached down and lifted out the jar first, because it was the lightest and she could carry it to the fire without straining her back. The wax seal broke cleanly with the tip of her pocket knife. Inside were 3 folded letters and what she recognized, after a moment, as a surveyor's field notes, small pages covered in a precise miniature hand with sketches of creek intersections and ridge profiles and numbers she didn't immediately understand. The first letter was addressed to no one in particular. It began, "If you have found this, then I am almost certainly dead, and the men who killed me are almost certainly still free." The writer was a man named August Teller, not someone she knew, who identified himself as a land surveyor contracted in the summer of 1871 by the Cumberland Timber and Land Consortium to survey a tract of hill country that the consortium was attempting to acquire from several farming families. What Teller had found, and what his letter documented in a surveyor's careful, evidence-bound language, was that the consortium's legal descriptions of the land, the descriptions they were using in court proceedings to claim the farmers had defaulted on surveyed boundaries, were fabricated. The actual survey, Teller's survey, showed that every family's holdings fell well within their original deed descriptions. The consortium's documents were forgeries, and the consortium, as Teller's field notes recorded in a margin notation, dated 3 days before the end of the summer, was principally owned and operated by a man named Harlan Foss of Dorado County, Tennessee, her late husband. Hattie read the letter twice. Then she set it down on her knee and looked at the fire. She had not loved Harlan Foss. She had not been asked to, but she had needed to believe, that the practical arrangement she had entered was at least an honest one, that the man she had kept house for, and managed accounts for, and sewn shirts for, had built what he had with his own legitimate labor, whatever else might be said about him. She thought about the farm families who had lost their land. She didn't know their names. She had never been to that part of the county, but she understood now, with the clarity of someone who had just been handed $30 and a deed to a place that was supposed to be worthless. Exactly what it felt like to be on the other end of a decision made by Harlan Foss. She thought of August Teller, dead in the hills somewhere. She thought of her father who had said, "A bad weld looks fine until the moment it fails, and when it fails, it takes the whole piece with it." She went back to the hidden chamber and lifted out the dispatch box. The lock was rusted. She solved this with her father's hammer, and a cold chisel she made from a nail, and a flat rock, crude, but sufficient, working by firelight until the mechanism gave with a crack that sounded like a small argument ending. Inside the box, wrapped in oilskin, were additional survey documents. Original plat maps, with official state survey marks, copies of deeds in their original legal descriptions, and, folded separately in a piece of India rubber cloth, a ledger, not Teller's, but one that appeared to be an internal consortium document, tracking payments. Payments to a county clerk, payments to a circuit judge, payments described as boundary adjustment fees and clerical correction allowances. The ledger was, she understood, a record of bribes. The canvas roll, when she untied it, contained Teller's actual survey maps, beautifully drawn, dimensioned to the inch, signed and dated, legally sufficient. They were the proof that the forged documents had replaced. Hattie rolled the canvas back up and tied it. She held the situation in her mind the way she had learned to hold a piece of iron in the fire, with patience and with attention to what it was becoming. Going to the county courthouse was not an option, not immediately, and perhaps not at all. The county clerk apparently was on the consortium's payroll. The circuit judge, apparently, was on the consortium's payroll. She had no money for a lawyer, no family to speak of, no standing that Clifton Foss's social connections couldn't erode in an afternoon. A young widow, barely a widow, showing up with documents from a hidden room in an outpost no one had officially acknowledged, making accusations against the Foss family's business dealings. She did not need to think long about how that would go. She needed someone she could trust, and she needed to know who, exactly, had lost their land, and whether any of them were in a position to help. There was one person she could think of who might know. A woman named Dorothea Pell, who had been a fixture in the county long before Hattie arrived, who ran a dry goods store in the small settlement of Kettle Creek, and who was known, without anyone having to say it directly, to be a person you could speak plainly to, without it going anywhere. Hattie had met Dorothea Pell exactly once at a church sale, and they had spoken for perhaps 10 minutes about the proper ratio of lard to flour in a pie crust. But Hattie had paid attention. She had noticed that Dorothea Pell watched people the way a good blacksmith watches a fire, steadily, without blinking, reading what she saw. It took her a full day's walk to reach Kettle Creek. Dorothea Pell was behind her counter when Hattie came through the door, and she looked at Hattie the way she looked at everything, steadily, measuring. "Harlan Foss's widow," she said. It wasn't a question. "Yes, ma'am," Hattie said. "Heard he left you the Kettle Creek outpost." Dorothea's expression made clear what she thought of that. "He did," Hattie said. "I've been staying there." She paused. "I found something in the floor." Dorothea Pell looked at her for a long moment. Then she came around the counter and locked the front door and turned the sign to closed. "Sit down," she said, "and start from the beginning." Hattie told her everything. She laid the letters and the ledger and the survey maps on the counter and watched Dorothea, read page by page, with the focused deliberateness of someone who had learned not to react to things until she fully understood them. When Dorothea finished, she was quiet for a moment. "I know who lost their land," she said at last. 4 families. The Beckett family, the Orrin Harwell family, the Cantrells, and a widow named Bess Norwood who had 40 acres her husband built from raw timber ground up. She paused. "Bess Norwood's son works in my warehouse. He's 24 years old and he's been carrying that particular piece of anger since he was 17. Can they be trusted?" Hattie asked. "They can be trusted," Dorothea said, "because they have nothing left to lose." She tapped the ledger. "This circuit judge, Alderman Prout, his term is up in the spring. There's a federal land commission reviewing outstanding disputes from the post-war settlement period. They're out of Nashville. They don't answer to anybody in this county." She looked at Hattie directly. "You send those original survey maps to the federal commission with a letter of documentation and Teller's sworn statement. Well, Teller's written statement, which functions as a sworn record given the circumstances of how he wrote it. And the consortium's forged documents become a federal matter, not a county one." It was, Hattie thought, the most useful 10 minutes of conversation she'd had since her father died. Over the following weeks, quietly, the way ice forms over a creek, not dramatically, not all at once, but inexorably, a small coalition assembled itself at the Kettle Creek outpost. Bess Norwood's son, whose name was Cal Norwood, came first, walking up the logging road on a Tuesday afternoon with 24 eggs and a look of compressed fury that had been waiting 7 years for somewhere to go. He was not a soft man, but he was a careful one, and when Hattie showed him the maps and explained what they documented, something in his face changed. Not relief, not yet, but the specific expression of a man who has been told for the first time that he was not wrong. The Beckett family sent their eldest daughter, a practical woman named Nance Beckett, who had been keeping her family's accounts since she was 14 and who looked at the consortium ledger the way Hattie had looked at the hollow stone, with attention. Measuring. Nance had names. She knew which former consortium employees had left the company unhappily. She knew which county recorder's deputy had been replaced under circumstances that struck people as irregular. Each person who came to the outpost brought something. Cal Norwood brought firewood. Nance Beckett brought her father's original deed and her own careful memory of the proceedings. A farmer named Ives Cordell, who had lost a woodlot to the consortium's boundary claims, brought 3 months of his own survey notes, made privately, that corroborated Teller's maps in every particular. They did not speak of revenge. They spoke of documentation. Hattie worked the forge room's hearth every evening, the only light coming from the fire she built to stay warm. Her father's hammer on the floor beside her, as she wrote and organized and copied, building the packet of materials that would go to Nashville. She had always known how to work by firelight. Her father had taught her that too. She thought about August Teller on many of those evenings. He had done his job honestly, and it had killed him. She didn't know where he was buried. She didn't know if he had family. But she had his maps, and she had his letter, and she intended to make sure they went somewhere that could use them. The packet left for Nashville in the first week of December, carried by a circuit rider Dorothea Pell trusted, who had no connection to the consortium or to anyone in the county who owed the Foss family any consideration. Hattie had hand-copied everything and kept the originals. She sealed the packet with wax, and she said nothing to anyone about it, beyond the people who already knew. Then they waited. Winter settled into the hills, and Hattie continued to work the outpost. She repaired the door and rehung it on new iron hinges she forged herself, using the hammer and a makeshift hearth setup that her father would have found technically adequate if aesthetically objectionable. She caulked the worst of the window gaps with a mixture of clay and wood ash and pine pitch. She relaid the collapsed portion of the porch roof, working from the ridge down. The way her father had taught her, a roof must always be built from the top, so the water has no way in. The outpost was becoming something. Cal Norwood noticed it when he came to bring news in January. He stood in the doorway and looked at the straight-hung door and the sealed windows and the repaired porch and said, "You did all this yourself." "Most of it," Hattie said. She was banking the forge fire. "The ridge work I did while Nance held the ladder." He was quiet for a moment. "My mother wants to bring you a ham. Tell her I won't say no." The Federal Land Commission's response came in late February. Not a dramatic arrival, not a marshal with papers, but a letter in an official envelope addressed to H. Drummond, Kettle Creek, Dorado County. The commission had received the documentation. They were opening a formal review of the consortium's land acquisitions in the 1871 survey period. A federal examiner would be visiting the county in the spring to take depositions. The letter was careful, legal language that said almost nothing directly. But what it did say between its careful lines was that August Teller's maps had been received and were being treated as credible evidence. The effect on the consortium was not immediate, but it was, Dorothea Pell told Hattie later, visible. The consortium's attorney filed 3 motions in county court in March. All 3 were denials of jurisdiction, which is what an attorney files when he knows the county court is the only court his client controls. Clifton Foss appeared at Dorothea's store in the first week of March and asked, in the careful way of a man who is frightened but cannot afford to show it, whether she had heard any rumors about a federal review. "I hear lots of things," Dorothea told him. "I'm a storekeeper." He left without buying anything. The formal proceedings took most of the spring and summer. Hattie gave a deposition in April, sitting across a table from a federal examiner named Cornelius Ward, who asked precise questions and wrote down her answers in a shorthand she couldn't read. She brought the originals. She brought Cal Norwood's testimony, written and notarized. She brought Nance Beckett and Ives Cordell. She brought August Teller's letter, and his maps and the dispatch box with the consortium's own bribery ledger inside it. And she set them all on the table, one at a time, with the steadiness of a woman who has been building toward this moment for months. The examiner looked at the bribery ledger for a long time. "Where exactly did you find this?" he asked. "Under the floor of a forge room in an outpost I was given as a settlement by the Foss estate," Hattie said. The outpost the consortium used as a field headquarters in 1871. The examiner looked at her. "And you were given it as a settlement?" "I was given it," Hattie said, "because no one thought it was worth anything." The commission's final ruling came in September. The consortium's land acquisitions in the 1871 survey period were vacated. The 4 families were restored to their original holdings. The falsified documents were entered into the federal record as fraudulent instruments. Circuit Judge Alderman Prout was removed from the bench, pending a state bar investigation. The county clerk resigned. Clifton Foss settled out of court with the federal commission for a sum that was not made public, but that Dorothea Pell, who knew how to read the way a county's financial mood shifted, estimated, had reduced the Foss mill operation to something that would require years of careful management to survive. He was not ruined, but he was diminished, and he knew it, and, perhaps more importantly, everyone else knew it too. Hattie Drummond stayed at the Kettle Creek outpost. She built a proper forge that winter, using stone from the creek bed and clay she mixed herself. She set the firepot with a precision her father would have recognized. Sloping the floor of the hearth toward the air inlet, at exactly the angle Ezra Drummond had taught her, was correct. She built the bellows from new leather, cut to pattern, the same pattern he had kept, tacked to the wall of his shop for 20 years. Word traveled. The way word travels in country communities. Not quickly, but surely. The woman at the Kettle Creek outpost could shoe a horse and hang a gate and set an iron fitting with the steadiness of someone who had been doing it all her life. By the following spring, she had more work than she could schedule. And people came up the logging road that was no longer quite as rutted as it had been, because Hattie had spent a wet October laying stone in the worst of the ruts, one wheelbarrow load at a time. The ham Bess Norwood sent in January had been followed by a cured pork shoulder in April and a wheel of hard cheese in August. The Beckett family's third daughter, 12 years old, asked if she could watch Hattie work the forge on a Saturday, and Hattie said yes, and by October, the girl was managing the bellows, with a competence that made Hattie think of herself at that age. Watching her father's hands move with such economy and sureness over work that had seemed to her then like a kind of magic, but that, she now understood, was simply attention, practiced until it became instinct. She kept August Teller's letter in a tin box on the shelf above the forge. Beside it she kept her father's hammer, because the hammer lived on the shelf when it wasn't in her hand, and she saw no reason to separate them. The outpost was warm and solid around her, smelling of coal smoke and iron and the pine pitch she'd used to seal the window frames. On winter evenings, she could stand at the door and see the lights of Kettle Fork in the valley below, small and steady, and know that below those lights were 4 families sleeping on land that was theirs again. She had not done it alone, but she had found what was hidden in the floor, and she had known what it was, and she had known what to do with it. Clifton Foss had believed the outpost was worthless because no one had told him what was inside it. He had believed Hattie Drummond was manageable because no one had told him who she was. He had given her $30 and a deed to the one place in the county where August Teller had left everything she needed. Ezra Drummond had told her once, heating a piece of bar stock until it reached the right color. That iron is not a forgiving material. It remembers every mistake. But if you know what you're doing, if you've paid attention, if you've put in the hours, you can take something cold and hard and seemingly intractable and make it into exactly what you need it to be. It turned out that applied to more than iron. We'll let you sit with that for a moment, and we'll ask you this. When you were listening to Hattie's story, which moment stayed with you the longest? Was it the hollow stone and that first knock of the hammer in the silence? Was it Clifton Foss, frightened in a dry goods store, trying to seem casual? Or was it something quieter than either of those? Let us know in the comments. We'd love to hear what you're thinking, wherever you're watching from tonight.